Alright guys, welcome back to another woodworking video. So in today's video, we're stepping it up a notch a little bit. We're going to be combining the box joints from the last video with a live edge piece of walnut. So we're just going to be making a little side table with two different drawers, and so most of it's going to be made out of maple. As you can see behind me, got a big old chunk of maple that we're going to be cutting down, and that's going to be super fun to play with. Plan is to make two boxes with finger joints or box joints all around all four corners. Join those with some nice square legs from this big chunk you see behind me. Then for our drawer fronts, we're going to be cutting this piece in half and making our two drawer fronts out of it. So they're just going to be nice narrow drawers. This thing's only going to be about 30 inches tall, and it's just going to be a super nice small piece of furniture. I've got some great looking drawer slides in the mail right now, and they'll be here pretty quick, so hopefully we won't have to postpone this project too much, but everything is kind of looking good. So took my time, planned everything out, and forgot my notebook inside, so I'll have to get that before I start cutting. So we're just gonna jump right into this project and get into the best part, which is milling this pile of rough lumber behind me. So by far the most interesting part of this project was starting with this 8x4 piece of maple. Now this is by far the biggest chunk of wood I have ever dealt with in the 3 or 4 years I've been kind of doing some woodworking. And just moving this piece of wood around, trying to cut through it, everything about it just presented its own set of challenges. It took way too many passes with the miter saw to finally get through it. Then once I got over to the table saw, it got a lot more interesting. So I started by just doing a few shallow passes with a 24 tooth blade, so that I wanted to try and avoid overheating, and I didn't want the piece to cinch up on the blade and cause more issues. Now, I learned after I raised the blade on the first cut that when doing the second cut that I needed to do, if I just flipped the piece over, it was much cleaner and much easier to do. That's what I did for the other 3 legs. So once I had all the leg pieces jointed and nice and flat, I used the new trick I learned where you just dampen the surface of maple before passing it through the planer to completely prevent chip out while going through the planer, and I started on the box pieces. So these were quite a bit easier. I'm going for 3/4 inch thick pieces of wood, so I can just go with my 4x4 pieces of maple, cut them down to their rough sizes so they fit nicely on my jointer, and everything just becomes very easy to work with. I mean, anything compared to that 8x4 chunk seems easy at this point. The fun thing though, well, jointing all these pieces of maple, and there's a lot of them, and it made a lot of very large fluffy chunks, is that my dust collector filled up and ended up exploding everywhere on the floor. So that was kind of a shock, but nothing too serious. And once they were all jointed nice and flat, I could plane them down to their final 3/4 inch thickness. So with all our pieces perfectly square, it's time to finish off squaring the one side and start putting these things together. So by the time I had the panels together, I ended up having to cut an extra 3rd piece that you'll see in these clips. And I did that off camera just because it wasn't super important or super different. And so using pipe clamps and some Titebond 2, I was able to glue up 2 panels at a time. Now each of these panels will be cut into a top and a side piece for each box, making the most use out of each piece of wood. Now since I have a jointer and planer and all the abilities to make things super nice, putting these panels together was very easy. And I have to say that if I didn't have a jointer, making panels like this would not be nearly as enjoyable. For the most part, the joints were perfectly flat. There was a little bit of cleanup with an old chisel on the glue joints. And after that, I could plane them down to their final thickness, where I took them just under 3/4 inch to make them a little bit easier to work with and to make sure I could get them as flat as possible, and all 3 pieces were the exact same thickness. Alright, so we're about halfway through the project now. We've got all of our rough lumber milled down into our specifically sized pieces. So everything went surprisingly well, a lot better than I was actually expecting. All of our panels now are nice and flat.
Then the last thing to do with the panels before getting into work with them was just trimming them down to their final sizes and squaring up one edge on the table saw. After that, I could cut the top and bottom pieces from my panels. And once all the tops and bottoms were cut out, the last thing to do was to mark off exactly how much I needed and figure out my lengths of my short panels and cut them to size. Now this is where things started to go wrong. So I started by installing the Dado Stack with a 1/4 inch blade on it and planned my pieces out. So trying to do the box joints ended up being kind of a questionable thing. Just because I haven't done it nearly as much as I should have before attempting a project like this. And so what ended up happening was my pieces, the fingers were either misaligned because there's just enough error that I didn't pick it up in those small boxes, but by the time I did something this big, I ended up screwing it up. So, simple fix, I just had to cut the fingers off the 2 pieces that I did, and we were back in business. So once I figured out my game plan, I jumped into sanding the insides of the boxes, because that is a pain in the butt to sand afterwards. So I started with 60 grit and went all the way up to 220 to give them that really nice, smooth, clean feeling on the inside. With those cut, I could start to cut dados into the top and bottom panels. These will eventually hold the side pieces and just help keep everything a little bit more square. Now because I just have a standard dado stack, I had to clean them up on the router. So I just set the router bit slightly higher than the dado groove I'd cut and went and cleaned up all the panels. And so once my dados were all cleaned up and everything was ready to go, I decided on one of my boxes to try something new, putting masking tape on the inside to try and prevent glue squeeze out from sticking to the inside. Now this eventually ended up being a problem later on, and so I'm really glad I only ended up doing it on one of the boxes. And you can see here just how easy assembly is with those dado joints. Everything just kind of seeds together beautifully, and you've got perfectly flat faces to reference each piece against. And so these boxes are extremely heavy, especially when they've got all these clamps on them. So manhandling them around was quite interesting. And so most of our joints were pretty good, but there was just a little bit of cleanup that had to be done. So removing the tape from the inside of the boxes, this is where we started to have the issues. As you can see, it kind of ripped away. Then cleaning up the edges with a flush trim bit on the router. And cleaning up the front faces on the table saw by just spinning it around on all 4 sides and making a thin cut. Then once that was done, I could start cutting some plugs. Now I cut these plugs from Walnut for a nice contrasting look. Then with the plugs cut, I went and started doing some small accent holes. Now I don't have a drill press right at the moment, but I bought this little thing that kind of acts as a mobile drill press. And so it allowed me to get nice straight holes to install the plugs. Then with the plugs in, all I had to do was cut them flush and fine tune it with a chisel. And that was our 2 boxes all put together and ready to go. So this is the part where things started to get interesting. I had 2 nice square boxes, and now it was time to make them into a piece of furniture. So I flattened one face on the table saw, measured out my inner box dimensions, so the length for the middle legs, and set that on my new miter gauge, which has actually been quite a big help in this whole process. And so this way I can get nice, clean, repeatable cuts. So with the first one here, you just see I bump it up against the stop, run it through, and we are left with an exact size leg piece for what I needed. And after that, it was just a matter of running the other 3 leg lengths through, and we were good to go. So with those middle pieces in, I could measure how much I needed to get this thing up to a total of 32 inches tall. So with that measurement, I was able to cut the rest of the leg blanks down to their final size, giving the feet of the side table. And so with all the leg blanks cut, I spent some time looking over each side, picking exactly which ones I wanted to face the front and which pieces were going to be tops and bottoms. This will help in our next step of drilling in all the dowel holes. Now, if you have something like a biscuit joiner, domino joiner, any of these other things, it'll be quite a bit easier, but I kind of like the ideas of dowels, and this little self-centering jig made things so very easy. For placing the holes on the cabinet, I came up with this little idea of using an offcut piece of one of the legs to perfectly align the holes onto the boxes. So with all the holes drilled, I was able to put the dowels into the middle pieces and then move on to sanding the outside of the boxes. These got the same treatment of starting with 60 grit and going all the way up to 220. At this point, I could start gluing on the middle section. So again, very nerve-wracking trying to get everything perfectly aligned. Now, the bottom box was quite easy because you're just putting one leg on at a time. This top box, though, is where things again got very interesting. Trying to line up 8 individual dowels, and I have to say my dowel holes on the box were not super accurately or well aligned, so there was a little bit of variance in them, making it quite a bit tighter. But it did eventually end up going together quite well. With a few taps from a rubber mallet, I got the boxes together, and the rest was all down to clamping pressure. So whatever small gaps were still kind of there, I just forced it all together with my F-clamps, and we were good to go. And so while that part was drying, I got on to working onto the feet. So I wanted to add a small 2-inch taper to the bottom of the feet just to make the piece seem a little bit lighter and have just a little bit more visual interest at the bottom. Now, this is a super simple jig I set up. I'll probably make a better one in the future, but for this project I just wanted to try out this technique and see if I liked it. And I have to say, it is a super simple, cool looking thing to do to a very clean, simple, square piece of furniture. Now, the legs ended up being quite a challenge to glue on. So the way you're seeing me glue it on here is not how I ended up actually doing it. You'll see in just a second here how I ended up finally doing it. Basically, I just used a scrap piece of pine holding the 2 legs against it, and then I clamped on some squares and triangles and all this stuff to try and keep those legs perfectly square while they're drying. The final step was to get some extra sawdust to help fill my gaps and just touch up any small gaps that I had. And at this point, I could sand the whole thing down to my full 220 grit finish. And the very last step of installing these legs was kind of, I don't know if it's a super original idea or super ingenious, but I wanted to make sure the feet were perfectly flat, so I got this nice piece of flat MDF, spray adhesive on, some 100 grit sandpaper, and all I had to do was just shift the table around on the sandpaper till all the legs leveled themselves out. There's a couple legs that I kind of had to individually touch up to get a perfectly level, but within a few passes, all the feet were nice and level. And so on this project, I decided to try something a little bit different. I went with Varathane pure oil finish. I don't know the specifics about it, what exactly is involved. All I know is that it's a nice oil finish, and I prefer to use oil finishes rather than like polyurethane or something like that. It's just because I think they give a little bit of a cleaner finish, and it's just what I prefer. And so I applied this Varathane oil over the entire thing. Then once it had dried, I decided rather than doing multiple coats of the Varathane, I would go over it with some paste wax. Now I forgot to get some footage of that, so you'll just have to take my word for it, but the paste wax finish makes this thing just super smooth to the touch and absolutely beautiful.